I'm former Congressman John Sweeney. I'm a recovering alcoholic, and this is Inside Addiction.
John, tell me how it was growing up for you.
You know, I grew up in a very loving family in home, not unlike the average American family in the late 50s throughout the 60s. The one distinction I guess I would make that now, a couple of years into recovery, that I recognize is how foreign the concept of alcoholism was to me and how accepted it was within my family unit, drinking and the use of alcohol throughout my house. I grew up, kind of a lonely kid in some respects. My mom, in that era, many women stayed at home and were stay-at-home moms. My mom was a professional person. She worked. My father worked. And so a lot of my life lessons came on my own, either with the people who were caretaking for me or just in hanging out on the streets and finding it from people. That having been said, it was a pretty average life.
So, how was school for you growing up? Did you have any hobbies? How
Yeah.
was life at home?
I was I was a difficult child. I was always diagnosed as being hyperactive and very active. And frankly, I had a hard time fitting into a lot of situations in a lot of places. I was full of anxiety. As I look back now, I recognize all of that. I was in trouble in a small way. I was always acting out. I remember my mom coming home from teachers' conferences in tears, and yet the teachers would always say if John could only settle down and apply himself, he'd do really well. I was a little rebellious. The hobbies I had, I was in Cub Scouts and then Boy Scouts, and then I discovered sports, and sports was a way for me to interact with people and really relate to people and feel like I belonged. Because feeling like I belonged was always a search that I was undertaking.
So, tell me about the first time that you can remember ever using.
Gee, I think I was 12 years old. I was hanging out with my buddies. The ideas of drinking and smoking cigarettes and girls changing and sex and things like that. I remember that summer was pretty prevalent. My dad, who had worked in a brewery at one point in his life, always had cases of beer lined in the basement, in the garage of the house. And my father would sit up at night and drink beer and read newspapers and watch television, and it was a normal process. He wasn't abusive. He was just someone who drank very heavily. My buddies and I decided it'd be interesting, exciting, cool if we were to steal a couple of those quarts of beer. And we did that and went up into the hills around where I lived and drank the beer. I remember the first taste of it. It wasn't that great. It was kind of bitter, it seemed to me. But I also remember the feel of it. And I remember that night, that warm feeling, that feeling of being almost carefree, of being giddy. And I was off to the races with that. I remember subsequent to that, any time that my buddies and I decided that that was something we wanted to do, and we did it once in a while. We would always, the biggest challenge and almost the excitement of it was not getting caught or trying to ensure you didn't get caught. And then the feeling of being drunk. I remember that night feeling almost freed and liberated from a lot of that tension that I'd always felt, or that a lot of that not belonging that I'd always felt as a kid.
So, your life continues, and how does your addiction continue, and how does that progression come to pass in accordance with how your life?
Well, at 12, I was a little bit off to the races. Although I took some time off from my drinking career. We would only do it on occasion. But I did grow up in the '60s, and society was going through a lot of changes. The use of drugs was becoming more noticed, more prevalent, more accepted in some respects as a means of expression by people. I had two older sisters who, a lot of the cultural debates that were going on in this society at the time were happening in my house. And some of them centered around the notion of drugs versus alcohol, and in some respects, the use of drugs, marijuana in particular, but other drugs as well, became a form of expression and independence. And as I turned into a teenager, I started to become a more regular user of substances that affected my mood, that altered my moods. I drank a lot. I think I began to drink a lot early and often. I drank as a blackout drinker. I drank as a weekend drinker. I would drink on during the week, and I'm talking now as I entered my sophomore, junior, and senior years of high school. I smoked a lot of pot. I did almost any other drug that became available. I experimented a lot in that period of time. And again, retrospectively, as I've gotten sober and I've cleared my head a little bit, I look back at that time, and some of that was the natural seeking who I was, what my identity was at that period of time, and some of that really was about losing myself and making sure that I wasn't going to feel those feelings of insecurity that were prevalent throughout my mind. That sense of not really fitting in and not belonging and not knowing where I belonged, some of which is natural at that age. But I was always at my best or most comfortable when I was stoned or drunk. And I was one or the other pretty much every weekend, and I was one or the other more frequently, especially the older I got, as I got into my senior year of high school, during the week and all the time. I began to lose interest in my hobbies, for example. I quit the football team. I began to want to be out more. I was separated from my family as much as I could be. I distanced myself from my family in part because I didn't want them to know about my use and how I felt. But it was, as I look back now, I was setting the framework, the foundation, if you will, for a life of drinking, a life of drinking and or drugging, and losing myself in substances.
So after high school, you go to college, and ultimately you go to law school. Tell me a little bit about how going from high school to going to college to going to law school, how as your education progressed, so did your addiction.
It wasn't a direct line. And again, as I look back, I recognize that my reckless behavior as it related to alcohol and substance use, my strong, the drive that I had and how I was drawn to that really interfered. I ended up dropping out of college in my second year, largely because I didn't know what I wanted to do or what I wanted to be, and I spent the next couple of years searching for that answer, usually in bars and usually at parties.